Welcome to Conversations. Last week, the show went over, and I saw that it was going to go over, so I asked our guest to join me again, and that is Mr. Harry Fritz. Welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
We kind of got, and it's my fault, we sort of got into telling the whole history of Montana, and obviously we couldn't do it in an hour.
Well, we got about half of it.
Yeah, well, we left it there, what, about the turn of the century. I'm going to try to guide this maybe in a way that isn't quite so precise and cover every decade the way that we were doing. I would like you to tell me about two figures that intrigue me. Jeanette Rankin I know something about, but Burton K. Wheeler is a name, he was a name to conjure with when I was a kid, and I still don't quite know what he did. He comes in and out of the book. You said he was the most powerful politician Montana had ever seen?
Most specialists think that he constructed the closest thing to a political machine that Montana politics has ever seen. He was a four-term Democratic senator from Montana, and one of the most influential Democrats in the National Democratic Party for those years. But ironically, he's not a very cohesive Democrat, not a very reliable one. 2 years after he was elected to the U.S. Senate for Montana as a Democrat, he bolted the party and ran for vice president under the Progressive Party ticket, a third-party ticket, and then rejoined the Democratic Party and got elected, re-elected. In 1937, he is the first leading Democrat to break with Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal over Franklin Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court, to increase the size of the membership of the Supreme Court. Franklin Roosevelt thought they were too old to do the job. He wanted to put a new guy in there for everyone over 70. Well, there were 6 of them over 70, so that would have been a 15-member Supreme Court. And Burton K. Wheeler, who had been instrumental in gaining the nomination, the Democratic nomination in 1932 for Franklin Roosevelt, opposed that and broke with the president and opposed him on most of his other policies for the rest of his terms.
So he was a thorn in Roosevelt's side.
He was.
Within his own ranks.
And he worked very closely with the Republican Party here in Montana. And ironically, his political machine elected Republicans in return for just token opposition for his own races. So he's primarily responsible for electing Jeanette Rankin, a Republican, to her second congressional term in 1940.
Which kind of leads us into Jeanette Rankin. She was the first woman senator?
First woman congressman.
She was in
representative, elected in 1916. A Missoulian from a prominent family, and a suffragist, and her early reputation comes as an advocate of the woman's right to vote. She worked throughout the Northwest and in Montana, and was successful in engineering a vote, a referendum on the question of women's suffrage in 1914. And you got to remember that only men are voting on the question of whether women should be allowed to vote. So it's an uphill battle. You can't take a sizable percentage of the electorate out there for granted. So that was an incredible personal achievement on her part to organize that campaign.
She voted against both world wars. That's what I think everybody knows.
She voted against American entry into World War I in April of 1917, but she had a lot of company in that vote. There were 50 U.S. representatives who opposed American involvement in the Great War. And most of them represented sizable German or Irish constituencies, as she did. But she was the only representative to vote against American entry into World War II. And she was a pacifist. She was an ideological pacifist. And her reputation between the wars in the 1920s and 1930s was as an international pacifist, traveled all over the world preaching peace. So at least she stuck to her guns in 1941, even though that was an exceedingly unpopular vote and certainly cost her any chance at re-election.
I am drawing a blank here. One thing you brought up is that she was a very astute politician, which kind of surprised me, that she was an organizer, she took charge, she looks sort of sweet and demure in those pictures you see of her.
And she had the courage of her convictions, and whether it's women's suffrage or pacifism, I don't think she let much get in her way to achieve those goals.
Would you care to remark on the fact that a state which is usually considered so backwards comes up with these liberal politicians like the two of them, Mike Mansfield?
Well, one of the characteristics of Montana politics for most of the 20th century was the fact that it sent liberals to Washington, mainly in the Senate and in the Western Congressional District, the 1st Congressional District, and retained conservatives of both parties at home in the governor's chair. Now, I don't think that's quite as true now as it used to be. There's still some truth to that observation, and political scientists are really at a loss to explain it. The best they can come up with is, well, these are powerful people, and they joined, for the most part, the majority party in Washington, where their power was most effective, and they could get things done for Montana. They could bring home the bacon in political terms. Or negatively, they could prevent bad things from happening to Montana.
This might be a good place to sort of pick up where we left last time. You were talking about the fact that up until a certain point, Montana history had been a question of this happened in Montana. Gold was found here. Anaconda copper is here. But that with the Depression and the turn, that we became very much part of the national.
I think we're always part of something that's going on nationally, whether it's on the Western frontier or the era of economic consolidation. I think the progressive era, the first quarter century or so of the 20th century, is the real turning point in Montana. It was a national progressive movement. And we had a progressive reform movement here in Montana. We had 4 major politicians who played a role on both stages, the state and the national. Jeanette Rankin and Burton K. Wheeler, and Joseph Dixon was another, who was Theodore Roosevelt's manager, campaign manager in 1912 when he ran for the presidency, and then served as governor in the 1920s. And the other was U.S. Senator Thomas J. Walsh, who was Dixon's compatriot in the Senate for many years.
Did these 4 people get things from Montana that, I shouldn't say that we shouldn't get, but that they saw that Montana was well taken care of in terms of
I think so.
government projects?
Up until the 1930s, the government didn't do much, but Senator Dixon, for example, secured passage of the enlarged Homestead Act of 1909, which doubled the size of a homestead that one could claim from 160 to 320 acres. And that certainly contributed to the big land rush, the farmer's frontier, in the next decade or so. Senator Burton K. Wheeler in the 1930s is instrumental in securing Franklin Roosevelt's approval of the Fort Peck Dam, first big New Deal public works project. So
that came before the Tennessee Valley?
Yes, it did.
So Montana.
Yep.
I'm going to throw this out. The Montana character, it comes up in your book every once in a while. You talk about events that have left a mark or a scar. That sort of implies that you have a definition of the Montana character somewhere.
Well, that whole concept of a regional character or a national character, in this case a state character, is really vague and ambiguous, because for every characteristic you cite, I'll cite its precise opposite. which is one of the reasons this book is called Land of Contrast. I think most Montanans like to regard themselves, and myth is just as important as reality, I think, when we're talking about character. Most Montanans like to regard themselves as independent, hardworking, not dependent on any aid or assistance from anybody, including the federal government. It's a frontier heritage. But at the same time, we do exist in sometimes a cooperative and sometimes a rather contentious partnership with the federal government and with its agencies, and together they make Montana work in agriculture, in irrigation, in other public works projects, in state assistance in hard times, such as a drought.
Gary Cooper was from Montana. I think for a lot of Montanans, that was, for me anyway, I sort of, in my wilder moments, I mean, I'm from a place that has Gary Cooper.
Right.
You have to have a
Gary
certain
Cooper in Mansfield.
Yeah, moral values and.
I mean, both Cooper and Mansfield are noteworthy for monosyllabic answers to questions. Yep. Nope. I think Mike Mansfield still holds the record for the number of questions asked at a session of Meet the Press, because his answers were one word. I'm sure the reporters ran out of questions before he ran out of answers.
Is that old joke with Calvin Coolidge? The woman says, I bet I can, I made a bet with someone that I could get you to say more than 3 words, and he said, you lose.
You lose.
I'm kind of switching around on you here, Harry. Let's go to the economic shift from east to west. We kind of left things back around the turn of the century. Copper is still there. Some out-of-state company for a while gets hold of Anaconda Copper, doesn't it?
Well, Anaconda Copper went public. That is, it sold shares on the stock market as early as 1891. So it's not a Montana corporation anymore. It's a corporation that's owned by the shareholders and run by a board of directors, which meets in New York City. So it never really, only in the 1880s, in the first years of its creation, was it a Montana-operated company. It's an out-of-state company.
When did it really start losing its clout, so to speak?
Well, I think after the Second World War. Copper, mining copper is a patriotic duty. Copper prices are high in the war. Wages went up for miners in Anaconda's mines in Butte. It was doing very well. But after the war, competition, I think, from international sources, many of them owned by Anaconda Copper itself, made Montana too expensive to bear. You could mine copper in Chile, where the Anaconda Company had extensive holdings, and pay the workers there about 1/10 of the labor cost. They're mining copper via the open pit mining operation in Utah and Arizona, in Chile and elsewhere. We're still mining copper in Butte by expensive underground hard rock miners. Many of these have to be skilled laborers, highly paid laborers. So that's when Anaconda considered and finally adopted the open pit mining operation that we know today as the Berkeley pit. It started that in 1953. And in an attempt to cut its labor force, and it did, it cut its labor force almost in half in the decade of the 1950s. But still, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, Anaconda was a corporation in serious trouble. It was badly managed. It had made poor investments. Rising environmental concerns had it on the ropes. Its mines in Chile were nationalized by the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Cuba. And copper prices were declining. Basically, the market for copper disappeared. It had been used for 100 years to make wires, copper wires, to transmit energy, electricity. And in the 60s and 70s, those copper wires were replaced by fiber optic cables that transmit light at incredibly faster than cable. All of a sudden, the market disappeared. And so Anaconda tried to react by curbing some investments, but couldn't make it and sold out in 1976 to Atlantic Richfield.
Leaving what kind of a legacy? Before we go, are you saying that the pit started in the 50s?
It started in 1953 at the shaft, the top of the ridge of the Berkeley mine.
Okay, because
One of many Anaconda mines in Butte.
I was 7, and I don't know, it just seems like the pit has always been there, and I didn't realize that it was that recent that they'd started.
Couldn't really see much of it, didn't make that big an impression until the mid or late 50s, and then it began to expand and deepen and absorb some of the colorful ethnic neighborhoods of Butte and approach the city itself. I mean, Anaconda had always resisted open pit mining in Butte because the copper lay directly under the city. And in response, I think the city of Butte moved off the hill, away from the mine, and out on the flats. Most of the new developments in Butte over the last 30 or 40 years are out on the flats rather than up on the hill.
You know, I have to confess, I know nothing. We have this pit. What are we doing with it? What's anybody going to do with it? What are the dangers?
Well, the pit is filling with toxic wastewater, naturally. It's not filling quite as fast. The pit is so big that it embraced 2 separate stream drainages. 2 streams were flowing into the pit. Well, they've blocked those and rerouted those streams. So it's only filling now with natural underground water at about half the rate that it was. But it's still only about 25 feet, the level of the water, away from what they call in Butte the alluvium gravel interface. That is, it's still in bedrock. The water is still in bedrock, but it's going to hit in about 25 more feet the gravel surface of Butte. The water is going to get into Butte groundwater if it rises that high without treatment. So it's a problem that's coming. It's not coming as fast as it used to be, but it's 10 or 15 years away.
What about some of the other legacies of the mining that were left in the state?
Well, we have the largest Superfund site in the country, the Clark Fork Operational Unit, that runs all the way from the Warm Spring Ponds to the Milltown Dam in Missoula, 100 miles. There are other Superfund sites in Butte itself where mine tailings were stored, for example. So we have an environmental legacy. But I don't think that here in the present we should simply criticize the Anaconda Company because at the time it practiced state-of-the-art environmental techniques, pretty primitive by today's standards, but I mean, one of them was, for example, is to build a high smokestack and let the wind blow the smoke away. That was an environmental preservation technique. But the Anaconda Company employed thousands of people for many, many years in the 19th and 20th century in Montana. It's totally responsible for entire communities in Butte, in Great Falls, in Anaconda, who relied on the company for their education, for their livelihood, for their security. And as long as it was around, it served an important economic and cultural function in the state of Montana.
Let's talk about the wood products industry here in the state. Can you do somewhat the same? What are the prospects for the future? What is it done for the past?
My bottom line has always been that the state of Montana grows 1.3 billion board feet of timber per year. So you're always going to have a timber industry. You need, I think, to practice a sustained logging program. 1.3 billion board feet. That's a lot of timber, and that'll ensure that we have a permanent timber industry in Montana. I think it would be helpful too if the North American Free Trade Agreement were renegotiated so that we wouldn't have to import all of our lodgepole pine from Canada. There's 32 log home companies in the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana, and they all import their lodgepole pine from Canada. But Montana grows more lodgepole pine than any other state in the nation. So, and lodgepole pine is a rapidly growing product. For many years, it was just seen as a waste crop. You pushed them over. But in about 40 years, you can get a decent-sized lodgepole pine. There'll always be a wood products industry here. But it peaked in 1955. Now, that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it's been struggling. It's been resisting the lack of a federal housing program, high interest rates, periodic recessions, rising environmental concerns, a lack of saw logs that are 2 feet thick at the 2 feet in diameter, which have been pretty much cut out, technological changes which have increased milling capacity and put more demands on the forest. But I would say that the logging industry, the employment in the wood products industry, and that's defined as loggers and sawmill workers and log truck drivers and log home manufacturers and finished carpentry, people who make sashes and doors and jambs and so forth. The employment in the wood products industry has actually been pretty stable over the last 20 years or so. Some mills have closed, but the employment has remained pretty steady, and the counties in which the wood products industry is located, particularly Flathead County, but also Mineral County and Sanders County, these are among the fastest growing counties in Montana. So the logging industry is not slowing growth and development in these counties.
Let's talk about farming. When we were last together, we talked about droughts that made it seem that you couldn't farm out there at all, and yet nowadays you go down there and there are endless fields of sugar beets and all kinds of things.
Sugar beets are irrigated.
Okay, so this...
And right now, eastern Montana is in the throes of a drought. I can't remember the exact statistics, but the decade of the 1990s is supposedly the warmest decade in recorded history, and drought has been more common than not in the decade, and wheat prices are low, so Montana farmers are hurting. The federal government actually contributes more to farm income in Montana in recent years than farmers themselves make by selling their crops on the open market. So average age of a farmer in eastern Montana is rapidly approaching 60, and the children don't seem anxious to take up that livelihood. So I think we're approaching in a day of reckoning in agriculture. If it is true that the average annual temperature is going to increase by 3 or 4 or 5 degrees over the next half century, as some experts predict, then agriculture as we know it on the northern plains is not going to survive.
You threw out an idea that pops up every once in a while, the idea of the government just buying those eastern counties and letting the buffalo roam, and
that's
the deer and the antelope play, whatever.
That's the solution advanced by a couple of eastern demographers who have documented. I mean, I don't think you can find any fault with their results of their research, their statistical investigations. They have documented serious depopulation on the Great Plains. And you can't find fault with that conclusion. Now, their solution for the federal government to buy up the private land and tear down the fences and reintroduce the buffalo is a bit more controversial.
Yeah.
Try selling that to the farmers and ranchers of eastern Montana.
I taught high school in North Dakota for a year, and then also there's the thing that you need less and less people for some of these agricultural things. And Dad may own a huge farm, but the kids don't want it,
right.
And the only time it really needs work is when the threshers come through, and it's not The rest of the time, they sit and drink and get old in those little communities.
Well, it's in 1789 when the country began under the Constitution, probably about 85% of the population were farmers. And now it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2%. It's been falling steadily. And even before the Civil War, more adults were non-farmers in the North than farmers. I don't think that great divide was crossed in the South until the 20th century. But the percentage of agrarians in the society has been declining for over 200 years and shows no signs of stopping. I mean, one man in a $500,000 combine can do the work of scores of farm laborers from the 19th century.
So where are people finding jobs?
It's, they're not finding them in the wood products industry, which has fewer than 2% of the labor force in Montana. They're not finding them in the mining industry, which is less than 1/2 of 1% of the labor force in Montana. They're finding jobs in what is generally called a sales and service economy, which is what Montana has become, which is what most of America has become. About 75% of our output now is generally described as sales and service, which is retail trade, transportation, banking, insurance companies, real estate, hospital services, government, education. It's a pretty broad category, but it accounts for about 75% of the sales value of Montana business.
I don't want to get away from this idea that those eastern counties, what's happening to them. Population is dramatically lowering.
There were 23 counties in Montana in the 1990s. That's over 40% of our counties. Most of them are located out there in central and eastern Montana that lost population in the 90s. I mean, the state of Montana gained over 100,000 people. One of the decades of the most rapid growth in our history. Over 100,000 new Montanans, and yet 40% of the counties suffered a net loss in population. Another 17 counties just kind of stayed about even. So you're looking at 100,000 new Montanans coming to only 16 counties, most of them in western Montana, swinging around to kind of south central Montana, Gallatin County and Yellowstone County. So this book is called Land of Contrast.
Yes,
And
we
one
wanted
of
to
the
mention at some point that we're
I'll
plugging your
mention it
book.
every now and then, and one of the contrasts, right from the beginning, has been eastern Montana versus western Montana. A plains environment with farming and ranching, and a mountain environment with mining and logging. Those contrasts have been with us from the beginning. But my argument here is that these contrasts have never been as sharp and never been as clear, and they're becoming even more so year by year. And I don't know how this is going to wash out in the future, or what the consequences of it will be. Eastern Montana is undergoing demographic stagnation and demographic decline, and western Montana is growing by leaps and bounds. These are serious differences between the two regions.
Billings is not taking up the slack, or I mean, is Billings growing?
Billings is one of the 16 counties that's growing, and probably a lot of the people who leave farms and ranches and small towns in eastern Montana are moving to Billings, moving into Billings. That's where they shop, that's where the hospitals are, that's where the institutions of higher learning are, and smaller towns are suffering. We
approved a new constitution in 72. Did that address some of these issues?
Well, not really.
No?
The Constitution, I think, and as a legal document, a political constitutional document, can't do much about these broad demographic, cultural, economic trends and developments. But one of the things the Constitution of 1972 did was to establish single-member legislative districts. In 1990, for example, the state had about 800,000 people, 100 representatives. So the state is divided up into 100 legislative districts of roughly 8,000 people apiece. Now we have 900,000 people. We're going to be reapportioned. We're going to divide the state up again into 100 legislative districts. Each one of them is going to have 9,000 people apiece. What this means for eastern Montana is that its population stagnation and or decline is going to cost it the equivalent of 5 representatives. Eastern Montana now has 5 representatives in the Montana House of Representatives that are going to be shifted to western Montana. It's going to lose 5, western Montana is going to gain 5 after this reapportionment. So political power is shifting from the east to the west.
Now, there was a shift from west to east there for a while. That was about what time? When when copper mining went down and ranching and farming became stronger in the east for a while?
In the 1970s and the early 1980s, when farmers had great years, some of their best years ever, commodity prices were high, it rained, and when the energy boom was activating the search for coal and for oil and gas in eastern Montana, and when the mining of coal increased by something like 10,000% in the decade of the 1970s, we had a population influx into eastern Montana. And for a while, things looked pretty rosy. But then the rain stopped, the commodity prices fell, the energy boom turned into the energy glut. And in the last 5 years of the 1980s, 26,000 people left eastern Montana. I mean, it's a net loss, just moved out of the state, 26,000 people. Most of them, I think, associated with the energy industry. So energy, and the energy industry hasn't done much at all since then. The energy industry at least had a brief influx of population. And if the energy industry ever cooks up again, and there's some hints that it might with the situation in the Middle East, then I think we can expect to see, at least temporarily, some people moving into eastern Montana.
That's because of the coal in the eastern part of the state, or
it's coal
and petroleum?
Although coal doesn't employ that many people. We're mining about 40 million tons a year, but it's not a very labor-intensive industry. What they like to do is look for oil, drill for oil. Even if they don't use it, they like to know it's there. Most of the activity in eastern Montana in the 70s and early 80s wasn't to utilize the oil that they found, but just to discover it and record it and chart it and cap it and know it's there. And there's all kinds of that exploratory drilling that can go on in the future. Drilling has become fantastically technological. They can drill sideways, they can drill corkscrews, they can drill underground at oblique angles and things like that. And they have processes now for pushing oil out of the wells that used to be sort of waste oil and left behind if it's underneath a crevice or something where they can't really get to it with a drill. So there's a lot of oil left in eastern Montana. And a new energy crisis will help it, at least temporarily. What eastern Montana really needs is about $4 a gallon gasoline, and it'll be right back in the driver's seat.
Our economy seems to fluctuate rather dramatically. Is that typical of other states, or is that a Montana phenomenon? Are we tied to industries that are subject to these kind of change?
I think it's more typical of a natural resource-based economy. It's certainly not untypical of the larger economy and the larger society. You can just trace booms and busts throughout American history. But they seem to be a little more deeply felt in a natural resource extractive economy. I mean, I think that the Great Depression, for example, of the 1930s, bad as it was elsewhere, was just extremely detrimental to the Montana economy. I mean, we're producing logs and copper and gold, and nobody needed it. So the value of a share of Anaconda Company stock fell by 97% in the 1930s. You needed an industrial recovery elsewhere before you could have a natural resource industry recovery in Montana.
One thing that was written into the Constitution is a respect for the environment. How does that impact economies that try to survive by...
The Constitution of 1972 was ordained, I think, at the height of the environmental movement, and it contains specific individual protections. The Montana Constitutional Bill of Rights guarantees each citizen the right to a clean and healthful environment, and it enjoins the government to provide a clean and healthful environment. It probably has more constitutional protections than any other state fundamental law in the country. I don't think those constitutional provisions have been very broadly or very amply interpreted by the Supreme Court until recently. It just made a decision which holds the government's feet to the fire on some of these environmental concerns. But I certainly don't think that environmental concerns are detrimental in the long run to a natural resource extractive industrial base. They do prescribe a few more rules that a developing corporation has to follow. And they certainly aren't detrimental to increased population. The timber industry, the mining industry, who are the ones that yell the loudest about environmental restrictions, are located in the counties of western Montana that are growing in leaps and bounds. So people are moving, I think, to Montana precisely because it has environmental protections.
Well, you rather implied, or if you didn't state it directly, that the concern in the Constitution for environmental safeguards was somewhat symbolic of Montanans finally becoming aware of what they had and trying to protect it, and that there was a real change in attitude.
When the environmental movement hit, and it's a recent movement. I mean, you can trace its precursor, the conservation movement of the early 20th century, back as far as you want to. But environmentalism is I think, mainly a post-World War II phenomenon, and really started to hit home in the 60s. And I think as it became a national movement, it was mainly concerned about cleaning up spots or places of environmental degradation around the country. And we have a few of those in Montana, like the Clark Fork Operational Unit. But I think Montanans looked around in the early 70s and say, hey, most of this state is still pretty pure environmentally. We have clean air, we have clean water in most places. We need to keep it that way. And so the environmental movement in Montana is more about, I think, preserving the high quality of life that we enjoy here rather than cleaning up the results of 100 or 200 years of development.
Then the last best place isn't totally myth.
Well, it's kind of a slogan and a book title, and catchy, and not particularly new. Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln called the United States the last best place, or the last best hope. But it applies, I think. It fits. We switched our state nickname, Greg, in the 1960s from the Treasure State to the Big Sky Country. And I think that kind of symbolizes
I didn't know that was
concern.
That's official?
Yeah. A shift in our concern and what the kind of image we wanted to put out there before our own citizens and before others who we wanted to encourage to visit the state. And the one economic bright spot in Montana in the last 15, 20 years is the travel and recreation industry. which by every statistical measurement improves every year in the number of visitors who come to Montana and the amount of money they spend when they get here.
What about our gambling? You know, when I was young, there was a guy in Billings called Mike Kachira who sponsored a dance program every week, and he'd get his mother and his gay son and everybody, and they'd dance around, and he was advocating legalized gambling. I left towards the end of the 60s, maybe 70, 71. I came back, and I mean, at that point, they all thought Mike was crazy. For year after year, he'd push gambling. I came back, and
gambling has a cyclical history in this state. We were a gambling state, wide open gambling state, up until about 1950. We had slot machines. We didn't go the whole Las Vegas way with roulette wheels and crap tables, but we had slot machines in Montana, punch cards and ring pulls and all kinds of things. And the state of Montana outlawed gambling by constitutional amendment in 1950.
I wasn't aware of that at all.
One of the reasons to support the Constitution of 1972 was that it did not contain a constitutional prohibition of gambling. It left the regulation of gambling up to the legislature. And so ever since the Constitution of 1972 went into effect in 1973, the legislature has determined what the level of gambling in Montana would be.
Were the people asked directly on gambling?
They were. They were asked directly to vote whether they wanted it or not. It passed overwhelmingly. More people voted for gambling, for regulated gambling, than for the Constitution, even though they had to have the Constitution in order to get regulated gambling. And the legislature has progressively allowed cash prizes for bingo, a state lottery, poker and live poker in the bars, video poker machines, video keno machines, which I think unfortunately are connected to the tavern industry, the liquor industry. But there it's drawn the line. The next step is blackjack. And the legislature has consistently turned down appeals to legalize blackjack. Or maybe the next step is a local option gambling. The legislature's turned that down as well. So that's where we've gone, and that's where we've stopped. But I think because the gambling industry is tied with the liquor industry, we've seen what some people have called the casinoization of Montana, and a lot of restaurants, a lot of establishments have turned into casinos. They serve cheap food, which angers other restaurants. We've taken one step to allow non-gambling restaurants to serve beer and wine. We took that step about 10 years ago, which I think was needed. But I think there's an anti-gambling consensus building in Montana. There was an effort just last year to put a measure on the ballot which would have outlawed gambling again, completely. Now, it didn't get enough signatures to qualify for the ballot, but I think it's the kind of cloud in the sky. It's a sign that Montanans are somewhat dissatisfied, I think, with the state of gambling in the state.
Sounds we're kind of kicking things around. Sales tax. Do you think we need it? Do you think we'll ever get it?
No, I don't see. Not in this century. The sales tax is a loaded political issue in Montana, and when people talk about it, they talk about far more than simply finance and how government should raise money. Most states adopted their sales taxes in the 1930s or the 1940s under the impact of the Depression and the war. Now, Montana, which had only a property tax for the first part of the century, adopted an income tax in the 30s, in 1932. And it adopted that income tax by popular majority vote. Over 63% of Montanans voted to have an income tax. Of course, this is the middle of the Great Depression. Nobody had an income.
Yeah.
Well, why not have an income tax? you're not going to pay it. But we didn't take the next step and adopt a sales tax. Since then, the sales tax has gotten loaded, the whole issue's gotten loaded with partisan considerations. It divided the Montana Power Company from the Anaconda Company for a generation or so. It's been turned down by the people twice, once in 1971 and once in 1993, by overwhelming margins. So I think the lesson is clear. The people of Montana don't want a sales tax.
Yeah. And I think any politician who doesn't realize that is in
Well, you can
trouble.
talk on one level about how a sales tax would be beneficial for economic growth and development. It would provide a more rational tax system with more, I mean, most people argue that if you rely on one tax or two, you're a little out of whack. I mean, why does Montana have the highest income tax rate in the nation? If we had a sales tax, we could lower that a little bit because we're getting some money out of that pot rather than all out of the income. But these are financial arguments and political arguments and maybe even rational arguments, but they don't alter the bottom line. The people have voted once in each of the last generations overwhelmingly against a sales tax. And I just don't see that they've changed their mind on that issue.
Let's skip to actually where your book ends. What's coming up on the power front? Could you explain some of this to me? It gets a little complicated.
It is hard to explain. Your power bills are going up.
That's not hard to explain.
And they're not, maybe they're not going up as much as people feared a year ago or even a half year ago when it looked like power bills would jump by 50% in the middle of next summer. Now they may only jump by as much as 20%. But it's a different ball game in Montana. We have unregulated power costs, and I think that we're going to see extremes, wildly oscillating extremes. Power rates are going to go sky high, and then they're going to fall off, and then they're going to go sky high again at the next crunch in an open and unregulated market. Montana, before it deregulated the price of energy, Montanans paid the 6th lowest power rates in the nation. And you wonder why they would upset that apple cart. But the big corporations who were freed from regulation by federal action thought they could get a better deal on the open market. So ironically, it's the big industrial customers of Montana Power who pushed for the deregulation bill in 1997. And for a year or so, they were successful in buying cheap power on the open market. But all of a sudden, due to increased demand, droughts, which meant there wasn't as much water behind the hydroelectric dams on the Columbia River especially, not enough power generation in California, difficulties in the national transmission network. All of a sudden, as we can remember now, from a year and a half ago, power rates skyrocketed, escalated, 1,000%, 1,200% in some.
I want to get this straight for myself, if for nothing else. It's businesses that thought they could get a better deal.
That's right.
Name one or two.
Smurfit Stone, Columbia
Okay.
Falls Aluminum, Montana Resources in Butte.
They thought they could get their power cheaper if
And they did get it cheaper
They
for a
went-
year or so.
they bought it elsewhere.
Right. And
How
then-
far away can you buy power?
Well, if you get a transmission network going, you can buy it from anywhere. Absolutely anywhere.
Okay.
Now, there are some regional agreements which limit the shipping of, but those regional blocks are going to have to come down, I think, if we're going to have a competitive market. But we saw what happened when power rates spiked. Montana Resources closed completely. 320 workers lost their jobs in the summer of 2000, and they haven't gotten them back yet. The Columbia Falls Aluminum Company, like other aluminum companies in the Pacific Northwest, and this is incredible, they found it cheaper to pay their workers for a year for not doing anything and sell their excess power on the open market.
Just sent their employees home.
Right.
Take a year
With
off.
year's pay.
And we'll still make a
Right.
profit selling our power.
Smurfit Stone laid off 150 workers. A couple of those have come back. The Asarco smelter in East Helena closed, partly from environmental concerns and partly from power costs. So deregulation had, in 2000, at least, the year 2000, a devastating effect on Montana industry.
There is another date coming up, isn't there, in this whole power?
July 1,
Okay.
2002 is when residential power rates will go up. Now, residences were protected, still regulated in a sense, at the lower rates under the original bill, but their exemption expires in the summer of 2002. So the defenders of deregulation argue that demand will increase supply. These are the laws of supply and demand. If there's a demand for electricity out there in an open market, new generating plants will be built. And the legislature fell all over itself, removing environmental roadblocks to the construction of new power generating plants in the last session. They're building power plants that burn oil. They're building power plants that burn coal. They want to try and increase the hydroelectric capacity of the dams in Montana. I think
They were doing windmills on the news last night.
well, that's alternate energy, which is, I think, a possibility in the future. And so maybe the defenders of a free market economy are right. Competition will, over time, lower power costs. But we're not going to get from here to there smoothly, because the power costs increased tremendously, and they haven't come down yet to where they were before deregulation passed, and whether they will come all the way down is an open question.
And then what happens July 1st, the coming year
Checkbook
is...
Your power rates, the Montana Power Company now says that residential power rates will increase by 20%.
Maybe more.
Probably not less.
Probably not there. Is that the biggest thing you see on the horizon as a problem for the state?
That's been, I think, the number one public policy issue in Montana for the last 4 years, since deregulation passed. Well, when deregulation passed in the spring of 1997, most people didn't pay any attention because it didn't have any immediate impact. But by the late fall of 1997, when the Montana Power Company announced that it was selling its hydroelectric generating facilities and its mine-mouth coal-fired electrical generating plants to Pennsylvania Power and Light, then they knew that this was a serious issue.
If you could, I don't like ask questions like this, but if you could change one thing about the Constitution or the way the government works, or what would that be? What do you think is our biggest stumbling block moving ahead?
No, I don't think. I would actually make the Constitution harder to change. I think the Constitution is much easier to change the Constitution of '72 than it was previous constitutions, and I think a constitution in some respect has to be fundamental law, and you figure out how to do things within that framework. But when the legislature or when interested citizens run into some kind of roadblock, some kind of constitutional roadblock to achieving their goals, they just change the Constitution. It's been amended more times since 1972, I think, than the previous Constitution was in its entire life. And I don't think most of the amendments to the Constitution have benefited the state or improved the level of government. I think we do pretty well as a state in governing ourselves. I think every citizen has a beef or two with the state legislature, but if they didn't, it wouldn't be representative government.
I think Montanans, now maybe I'm speaking only for myself, but are more proud to be Montanans than other states.
I don't think there's any question about that.
I went to California for a while, and I always thought of myself as, a Montanan. And I tried to explain to people that nothing happens, up there, everything happens at a distance, you know, and that you have a sense that you're
Well, I
are
think
separate.
Montanans have a sense that they know each other. Montana has been described as a medium-sized American city with long streets. And it's true that you know people in Billings. You're from Billings.
Oh, yeah.
You know people in the television industry, probably in every town in Montana. I know people in the education business all over the state of Montana. It's funny, you'll run into somebody out of state and tell them you're from Montana, and they'll say, "Oh, do you know so-and-so?" You know, Montana's a big, do you know so-and-so? Most of the time you do.
Lots of times you do. Hey, I want to thank you for coming on a second time. And we want to push the book one more time. Montana, Land of Contrast.
It's called Montana Land of Contrast. It is current as of last spring, so it's only a few months out.
Judy Mart's picture in it, so.
Judy Mart's picture.
Yeah, okay.
It's got the elections of 2000, the census of 2000, the deregulation issue, all covered in the book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.